Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. is committed to Israel's security and holding Iran accountable, but also de-escalation.
Separately, a CBS News poll finds Americans' approval of the way President Biden is handling the Israel-Hamas war is at its lowest, and more Americans want the president to encourage Israel to stop military action in Gaza. Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne join us now. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst who served in the George W. Bush administration. Joel is a CBS News political contributor, Democratic strategist, and chief communications officer for Move On. Joel, let me begin with you. How significantly are continued tensions in the Middle East hurting President Biden as he makes this reelection bid? As you know, historically, foreign affairs, sadly, I guess, but it's just common in American politics, foreign affairs and don't often weigh heavily on the minds of voters when they go to the polls on election day. Could this be different?
Yeah, this feels like it could be different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Vlad. You're right. Foreign affairs typically is not something that always reflects to American sentiment in their elections, but this is unique. I think that if you look at all the issues that could potentially plague the Biden coalition, I think this is probably the largest one for a couple of reasons. One, it takes a shot at stability in the world, which is really Joe Biden's case, right? Stability versus chaos. I foster stability. Donald Trump fosters chaos. If you have something that punctures a hole in that narrative, that's negative. Also, this just takes a direct shot at President Biden's coalition. It divides it in several ways. You have many young voters, many voters of color, obviously Muslim American voters who are really troubled by what they're seeing on their TVs every day and what they're hearing and how they are personally impacted by what's going on. And I think that is reflected in the overall negative trend of public sentiment related to the situation in the Middle East. And I think the president is always going to take that on the chin. That's the job of the president by most people's accounting. And I think most people are not going to look at the nuance. They're just going to look at the bottom line. And the president, that's always going to fall at his feet.
So, Leslie, in the meantime, voters are looking over at the House and Republicans are divided again. They're fighting with each other again, this time over aid to allies. Israel, yes, but more Ukraine and others. And once again, the risk of losing the speakership and a fight over the speakership position is rearing its ugly head. This can't be good for the Republican Party.
We love it. We just love being tortured, like politically, like, since that's the word of the day. I would argue that this is something that has been consistent with this Congress. The speaker understood what the challenges were going to be from the right flank. But I think with respect to kind of pulling back to the 30,000 view of the issue, I think Joel characterized it correctly. President Biden's under a tremendous amount of political pressure, and Republicans have been consistent. If we're going to talk about consistency, at least their alignment on support for Israel. There is alignment on that they feel that there's a one-sided pressure from Biden to Netanyahu in Israel. And now he said he would not say those words ceasefire. Now he's putting pressure for ceasefire. When you look at the optics of that, compared to, as you talked about, young people, particularly young voters, 100 Columbia University students being arrested yesterday for in many cases, they're pro-Hamas statements, their kind of actions and protests on the Golden Gate Bridge. You're seeing a lot of disruption in society. And I think that political pressure is going to really, the question is, bend more of the will of the Biden administration, and Republicans can really kind of stand strong in their lane in support of Israel. And to your point, Anne-Marie, when there is so much dissatisfaction within the Republican coalition, finding those areas of alignment become really important.
Leslie, Trump's in court. President Biden's been on the campaign trail. Talk about the contrast there.
Well, it hurts Trump in the sense that he has that gag order. He's saying it's completely unfair. You see him every day kind of morose and falling asleep in court. Not where you want your presidential candidate to be. You want to be on the campaign, having vigorous rallies, raising money, and shoring up some of those battleground states where he's doing incredibly well, not only with communities of color, but he's also starting to spread outside that margin of error in those battleground states. So it's a setback for certain, but Biden on the campaign trail has not done himself any favors either. Some of these kind of cannibalism stories within his family, some of these things that kind of get people scratching their head. There's not a lot of comfort. But what that means for voters when you're out there talking to them, it just pushes them further into their own corner. By the time we get to November, people will be telling us, I predict, that they made these decisions about who they supported a long time ago. It's going to be those suburban areas, those women that are going to move on the abortion issue, and some of these communities of color that are really going to be the deciding factor.
Meantime, Joel, former President Trump is consistently talking about the Biden White House at the courthouse in New York. Before he goes in, he makes sure to tell everyone that this witch hunt is because of the Biden White House, and strolls on into the courtroom. What we don't hear from President Biden is any talk of Trump's legal woes. But I wonder, and I understand the strategy, he's been doing that for a long time, and maybe he doesn't want to talk about this particular hush money trial, but I wonder if he can keep avoiding speaking about Trump's legal woes, especially if he continues to lean into the whole "this is a fight for democracy," because that's suggesting that the other guy is not fighting for democracy. Well, why not? Well, he's on trial. Can the president keep avoiding the legal woes of Donald Trump, because we're all talking about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Also, I'm making a note to myself to call Leslie after the segment and ask about cannibalism. We need to find
Well, Leslie knows things.
But related to your question about, President Biden and the choice he has to make about how to define Donald Trump, look, I think it's a prime strategic question for the campaign. And, I don't work for the campaign, but I think something I would consider is maybe is there a way you bring Vice President Harris into the public discussion, the public discourse? Former prosecutor. She's someone who really starred in that role, offering a contrast message when she was in the Senate, in some of those Supreme Court hearings that she was a part of as a Senate Judiciary Committee, I believe. Might be an interesting thing to pull her into. Your vice president is typically thought of as your quote unquote attack dog anyway. So maybe that's something that the president and his team are thinking about. But I think what the president wants to do is stay above the fray as much as he can to stay consistent with his brand. And I do agree with that as a strategic choice. Joe Biden's brand is a firewall between himself and between, the DOJ and between the prosecutorial things that his government has to do. I understand that there's a narrative that Donald Trump and his allies are pushing, but I think Joe Biden doesn't want to play into that. And so that's the tension at play there. I imagine this is an issue that the folks in Wilmington at Biden headquarters are constantly thinking about.
Joel, Leslie, let me ask you about what I think is the most interesting political news that we didn't talk about at all here this week on CBS, which is what happened in Michigan. The Michigan House of Representatives returned to Democratic majority this week after two special election wins filled open seats. Joel, I sometimes wonder if there is, either through polling, which we know sometimes can be flawed, or through just media coverage, that we're making out this race between President Biden and former President Trump to be closer than it sometimes is at the grassroots level. And here's why I wonder that, because in Michigan, which is a critical state, you're seeing, and just like you saw in Virginia with that special election, Democrats, even if you suggest that the campaign, a lot of the campaigning has to do with the issue of abortion, which is front of center, front of mind for a lot of people, but they are taking back seats that have traditionally been in play. What does that tell you? Does Michigan signal anything to you at all?
Or is Michigan sort of special? Because Vlad and I had talked about this.
Yeah.
And I sort of said, Michigan has had a rough road.
Yeah.
Right? I believe they stormed sort of the Capitol building. The governor, or there was a plot to kidnap her. There were lawsuits. I mean, Michigan was sort of front row and center to all of the tensions that led up to January 6th.
Right. But now, for the first time in 40 years, Democrats have a trifecta when it comes to the state of Michigan. So that, to me, signals something. But I'm not in it like the way you guys are.
Yeah, I'm going to take you into the mind of a paranoid political strategist, which is never take anything for granted. I was on the wrong side of a loss in Michigan with Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's a really close state and a really close country. But there is some data points to pay attention to. Gretchen Whitmer is the governor. She had a very successful reelection campaign there just 2 years ago, where she ran, I think, something like 11 points ahead of Joe Biden's popularity in the state. What that tells me is there is a blueprint for Democrats to be successful in the state. Democrats have figured out the right message there. And I'm no expert on the Republican Party of Michigan, but everything I understand of it is that the Republican Party in Michigan is a mess, in part because the Trump wing of the party and the moderate wing of the party can't figure out which way is which. And I think, by the way, that's the case in a lot of state parties around the country on the Republican side. And that's the type of thing in a really close election where the margins are thin that matters. Yeah. The unity on the Democratic side versus maybe a lack of unity on the Republican side.
Leslie?
I just want to jump in and say we got to take that with a grain of salt when you're talking about special elections. Those are not the same as a national presidential campaign. So offset years or these special elections are indicators perhaps of a fever when you're talking about the polling, but they're not necessarily predictors of where the national campaign is going to go with the president on top of the ticket. And there are some states that are purple states, except when you put Donald Trump up there and they turn solidly blue, kind of tilt toward the blue shade. So those are realities with that. But I think for the economic reasons, not just the Hamas Israel conflict, there's a lot of other dynamics in Michigan that will make it competitive going down till November.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me because Trump does have an enormous sway and pull on the party. But whenever somebody is either Trump-like or Trump adjacent, i.e. Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin or anybody, they don't have the kind of traction that he has.
Quick thing for you really quickly. Yeah. Those blue wall states in the upper Midwest, there's an interesting trend that's going on where I think there's a sense that Biden is struggling in those places, but the ones that are less diverse, like Michigan and Wisconsin, he's actually doing a little bit better than in some of the more diverse battleground states. That's early. There's a lot to kind of learn about what's going on the ground there. But I do think that says something about maybe some of the trends that maybe some like college-educated white voters may be trending towards Biden in a way that they haven't before. Again, wouldn't reach a conclusion about it, but just in some early polling I've seen, that's something I've been watching.
I like that wishful thinking, Joel.
It's Friday, guys. I mean, what else are we going to do? Leslie, Joel, thank you both very much. Appreciate it as always.